right, I'm going to dumb it down a little bit for this presentation. All right, so as you can see, I'm going to be talking about Cypress, the great and not so great. So this is going to be more of a story than it is to try to convince you to use this tool, and hopefully you guys can kind of see the worth of the tool itself. So before we start, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Chris Bautista. You can find me on most social media platforms at Chris Bautista with 3 A's. I'm a tech lead, staff engineer at Goat, whatever that really means, whatever. If you don't know what Goat is, check us out at goat.com. We're the world's largest marketplace for shoes in the world, so tons of traffic. So if we're down, it can be very devastating. I'm an exhausted father. Like you said, I may look 18, but I have a 1.5-year-old at home, and it's absolutely insane. So if I say anything wrong or you disagree, you can blame him. All right, and I'm also a new Californian. I've been here for a year, well, almost a year. I moved here in February last year. So I moved from the DC area. So basically I traded snow, hurricanes for earthquakes and fires now. So me and my wife are kind of deciding if this was a good idea in general. So before we get started, I kind of want to lay out an agenda for you guys to expect. First, we're going to talk about what end-to-end testing is and why you should care. Next, why you might not care, because that's very possible. And then we're going to talk about the problems that we currently have at Goat Group. And then that's going to pretty much lead us into the Cypress tool and how it helped us and how it could potentially help you at your company. And then we're going to talk about the frustrations that I encountered, so the not so great things that you typically won't hear people say during their Cypress presentations. So they may come attack me after this. So first, what is end-to-end testing and why should you care? So end-to-end testing is simply end-to-end test simulates scenarios how a real user would use the application, right? So we all write unit tests, we mock everything and basically test the only piece of code that we want to. That's great, you have 100% code coverage, whatever, but I go to your site and nothing works, that all means nothing to me, right? So as a user, I value these tests to make sure I want it to work the way it's supposed to. So why should you care? One big reason is continuous integration. You want that fast feedback loop. Every time you make a PR into master or whatever branch, you want to make sure that your code base is green, that you don't have any side effects and you're breaking anything else. So the side effect of that is you get faster QA cycles. And like we all love to do, we get more time developing and we have less time fixing bugs. So I don't know about you, but fixing bugs is the worst and it usually makes me question my career choice. So this is a godsend. And then third, real tests. So basically reiterating the definition on the previous slide, you're just testing your application like a real user would. And those are very valuable to the business. And then lastly, expand code coverage. And that simply means just execute more code during your test, right? Because unit tests, like I said, you're mocking everything and you're just running this isolated piece of code. When you run an end-to-end test, you're actually bootstrapping your whole app and loading everything. So you have more chances of catching any runtime errors or any exceptions like that. So why might you not care? Which a lot of people might not, and that's totally fine. So first is it takes a lot of time, money, and effort. So not only do you have to decide what you want to actually test, you have to now integrate this into your CI pipeline. You might have to fake the flakiness that's going to come with it, and then just writing the tests themselves could be a hard enough task. So that's a huge undertaking that may not be worth it for your company, or maybe you simply can't afford it at this time. Second, flakiness. If anyone has wrote end-to-end tests in general, flakiness is like the plague, right? Like if something fails, was it actually a failure? So then you lose confidence, right? So a classic case of flakiness, going back to a Selenium-based tool, usually if you're asserting that a button exists, maybe the visibility of that button depends on an API call, right? And then maybe one day the API call takes 3 seconds, right? So then you write your test to wait artificially for that button to show up after 3 seconds. But maybe one day that API decides to take 5 seconds. And now your test fails, but it wasn't actually a failure, right? You just didn't wait long enough. So what you end up doing is you basically bump up that wait to be 2 seconds longer and pray to your gods that it doesn't take any longer than that, right? So that's a classic case of flakiness. And then slow execution. So unlike unit tests, right? Everything's mocked except for the code that you want to test. You're actually executing your site and clicking through like a real user would. And you're actually making real HTTP requests. So inherently, it's just going to be slower. And if those 3 previous reasons weren't good enough, you just don't want to. And that's perfectly fine. I'm super lazy, to be honest. But I'm super passionate about end-to-end testing, so I'm hoping I can convince some people to go that route. So this is why we care. So these are our current problems at Goat. And I love that GIF on the right. It's so awesome. So we have a lot of reasons, but I'm going to narrow it down just because I have 20 minutes to talk about this, and I could talk all day. So the main reason was releases were painfully slow, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this pain. So why are the releases slow? So I have this super exciting graph that you can't read. I didn't think about that, and I didn't update it because I'm just going to talk about it in general. So do you see these two squares or these two rectangles, the two red ones on top and bottom? We'll just pay attention to those, and we'll just picture in our heads that the top one is basically where you get the sign off from QA, you pass code review, and now you're about to merge into your code base, right? And then the bottom one is where you get the thumbs up or thumbs down from QA. So without actually going into what's in those 4 blocks in between, we can just imagine the timeline could be anywhere from a day, days, or a week before we actually deploy a build, right? So as a developer, when I merge my code into master, we have a standard pipeline. We have like linting, the standard tests, unit tests, right? But by the time we get to the decision by QA, we find out that we broke something else in the code base. And most likely it's probably a core functionality of the site that we probably shouldn't have broke to begin with. But we find out a day, days, or a week later. So now that poor developer has to context switch, try to fix that bug, fix it, merge it into master, cherry pick it into the release branch, and then start the whole phase again with QA and hope that he didn't break anything else. So ideally, what you want to happen is you would want to know that you broke something at the top square, right? And save all that time. And that way you can just go about your day and code and be happy, right? So unfortunately, that wasn't the case with us, which is why we're going to talk about Cypress. So Cypress.io, what is it? Cypress is an open source test runner designed to make testing in the browser easy. And by that definition, that sounds exactly like what I want, right? So now we're going to talk about key features and kind of how it addresses the previous pain points I just went over. So the first one, super easy to set up and start writing and running tests. I believe when I first started using Cypress a couple of years ago, I just simply npm installed, and then I had a working end-to-end test in like 15 minutes. And it was like, that's unheard of, especially if whoever used Protractor or whatever, like it's terrible. I'm not going to go too far into that. And this hits the pain point of, it takes a lot of time, money, and effort, right? Because the faster I can get up and running, I save a lot of money, and now I can start writing tests, hopefully saving our business money. But it's not a silver bullet, right? This isn't going to actually solve this whole thing, but it's definitely going to soften the blow a little bit. So if I can save a penny for my company, then I think it's worth it. Next, easy GitHub and Circle CI integration. So if you remember my sweet graph for the slow feedback loop illustration, this is where we get that fast feedback loop. So I'm going to kind of show a quick demo of what a PR looks like at Goat Group. So here's a PR I just made for js.la, and I purposely failed a test just to show what that feedback looks like. Is that GPS? Anyways, that threw me off. Okay, so if your test fails automation, what Cypress does is inject this cool little UI here and gives you all this detail of like when it failed, what commit it failed on, and all that good stuff. But in addition to that, it also gives you a link to the actual test run. So if we check that out, we can see here that my spec was basically expecting a path of register, but I told it to expect oops, so that's why it's failing. So quick visibility there, but not only that, I get a picture of when it failed, right? So it shows me, the exact instance of what my DOM looked like when it failed. And if that's not good enough for me, I can play a video. And of course, that's going to break because this is a live demo. But ideally, what would happen is it would show you a video of the test run, and you would see it failing. So that's super awesome. And that's the kind of feedback we need as developers, because you don't want to waste a lot of time chasing a bug around. So as much information as you can get up front, that's amazing. So let's go. Sorry. Okay, next point. Network stubbing. So now we're at the point where Goat's like, cool, we bought into Cypress, let's start doing it. But we had a huge issue. We have, okay, let me back up. So we run our end-to-end test suite against a staging database, right? But we can't actually control that data. So that's a huge issue. What ends up happening is when we write end-to-end tests against pages that are data-driven, the data is inconsistent. So if I assert on a button that should show up based on some data, maybe tomorrow it doesn't show up, and now you have a failure. So what Cypress offers is a great feature called network stubbing. And effectively all that is allowing me to intercept any HTTP request in my application and return any response I want. So JSON, a picture, whatever, right? And that gives us a lot of flexibility, but it also has pros and cons. So the pros, super fast. You don't need a database up or a server. You can just run it, and you're not actually making HTTP requests, so it's super fast like that. But the downside, right? This is an end-to-end demo. It's not real end-to-end, right? You're mocking it just like you would in a unit test. But the upsides are you can actually, contrive scenarios really fast. So all your happy path scenarios, all your failure scenarios, those aren't necessarily easy to do when you're actually hitting a real API. So those are like the pros and cons there. Oh, one last con, let me back up. If the contract changes between your client and the API, we also won't catch that during test time because we're just mocking the responses. So that's another thing you have to look out for. So you have to weigh the trade-offs with your team. Generally, if it's a stable API, you should be perfectly fine. But don't take my word for that. Next point, automatic waiting. So you remember my point about in a Selenium-based tool, you basically wait 3 seconds and hope that the button shows up. We don't have to do that in Cypress. Cypress does that for us. And that leads for amazing developer experience and also way less flakiness than what you're used to. Debuggability, which is huge. So if you recall the PR, we had a picture, we had a video, everything we could ask for by not even touching the code base yet. But in addition, Cypress actually runs in the browser. And to be more specific, it runs in a Chrome browser. So what you can do is when you open your test runner, you can actually open up Chrome Developer Tools and have a very similar experience as if you were developing on your app locally. So you can put debugger statements and use dev tools to step through your code. And I think that's super valuable because I'm assuming everyone here is a front-end developer, and I'm assuming you're using Chrome unless you're some sort of psychopath. You should be familiar with those tools. And then this is a bonus, visual tooling integration. So if you're not familiar with what visual tooling is or what visual tools in general are, it's a tool that will just snapshot your screen or your DOM at the moment in time. And if anything, steers off course from that, you get alerted. And then basically, if there's a diff. So what we were experiencing at Go in our QA process is that maybe sometimes someone wants to refactor some Sass or some style components. But what happens is, you're not paying attention. Some of those are reusable. You end up breaking, some UI on another page, which isn't necessarily caught. So in our QA process, what ends up happening is a lot of our bugs weren't actually functional bugs. They were more like UI bugs. And it got pretty annoying because what ends up happening is it's like, is this on purpose? Is this on accident? Let's go ask the designer and see if this is what he wants. And you can see how that just adds a lot of noise into your process. So I just want to show you what an example of that looks like. So we use a tool called Percy. And if anyone's familiar with Cypress.io, if you go to their docs, they reference Percy and they reference Applet, which are two very popular tools. So we use Percy, and you see this super crazy diff right here. If I show you the original, so here's the original of our footer. And just pay attention, it's super simple. There's some fonts, some words there. But if I go to what the incoming changes, we see that the font just changed, right? And whether that's on purpose or not, we don't know. And then you can also see the diff here. So usually this is what you see immediately, so you can kind of point your eyes at where the differences are. But the point is that you're immediately alerted about this, so you can, you are most likely going to be protected from UI regressions. But also what this protects you from is being scared of refactoring code, because I'm assuming everyone here has tech debt at their company. Who by a show of hands are scared to death to fix that tech debt, right? And so by having tools like Cypress that can assert things functionally, and by having visual tooling that can look at things visually, that enables your team to kind of tackle those tasks. And that's also one of the main reasons why I like these kind of tools, right? Because, I don't know, I like rewriting code in general, so that's just how I feel. Cool. So, the not so great. Office fans? Yeah? Okay. All right, so now we talked about all the cool things and why you should do things, right? But now we're going to talk about the frustrations and why you probably will think I just wasted your time. No, it's not that bad. So this is usually the deal breaker for a lot of companies. It only supports Chrome. And this is going to be up to your company to whether you want to, take this chance or not. I know they're working on Firefox currently, and I believe that will probably come out sometime this year. But again, it's only Chrome. So if you're supporting IE, Safari, it's going to be up to you and your team to kind of make that decision. What I would recommend is maybe just write a couple of them and see what falls through the cracks on those other browsers, and then maybe you can potentially account for those in Chrome. But yeah, a lot of people end up looking another way once they see that bullet point. Next, does not support fetch out of the box. So this isn't a big deal. There's workarounds available. I have a GitHub thread right there that just has the workaround. This is not really a terrible thing. It's more or less that if you are interested to try this after this talk, you're not surprised that your fetch calls aren't working. Well, they are working, but Cypress just can't detect them, which makes it worthless, right? GraphQL support. So GraphQL support's all the rage now, I guess. So it's not supported out of the box. However, like the previous point, it is, thanks to the community, there are great workarounds available. And as far as the ones I've tried, they worked out pretty well. So if that's like a deal breaker for you, most likely someone in this GitHub thread has wrote a great.
What do you mean by GraphQL support?
Just gives you like GraphQL stubbing out of the box.
Oh, okay.
So like if you want to do like mocking and stuff, it gives you that kind of stuff. Okay, and the last point, site.route unable to mock same URL multiple times if requests happen quickly. What does that even mean? So site.route basically is a command in Cypress that allows you to either stub out requests or alert Cypress that a request has been responded to. So I encountered this issue because if you think about GraphQL, that URL is typically always going to be /GraphQL, right? And that's going to be the same URL every time. So just for example, let's say I loaded a page and I executed 3 GraphQL calls super fast, but at the same time I wanted to control those requests, meaning I'm using the network stubbing functionality. So the first request I want to return Nike, right? Second request I want to return Puma, and then third request I want to return Adidas. What ends up happening is if these requests happen so fast, the first request will happen, we'll stub it out perfectly fine, Nike, but the second and third ones will ignore my mocks and return Nike for all 3. So this is super annoying, and I don't think there's a great fix. I put a GitHub thread there, and I have a really hacky solution in that thread that works for us currently, but I know it's a big frustration for a lot of people. But more times than not, if you don't need to mock anything, you most likely will have a great experience. For us, in the instances where we had to mock data, that's where a lot of my frustrations came from. But that's not specifically what Cypress is the best at, I guess. So if you are in that situation like we are, you don't have the ability to have seeding scripts, you may potentially have a very frustrating experience like I have. But for the most part, it's been good. So that's it. And thank you for listening to my talk. Hopefully this was pretty informative.